I think that's really important in terms of language and terminology. I often hear people labeling individuals as either resilient athletes or
Yeah.
resilient individuals. And I often talk about resilience on a continuum where you can have higher or lower levels of resilience depending on context and depending on time. Um, and I think if we move away, if we continue using that label of resilient, it kind of implies that there's nothing you can do about your resilience levels. Um, Whereas again, we know that actually we need to think about resilience as a capacity that needs to be developed, trained, and practiced in the same way that you might think about your technical and your physical skills.
Hey, Mus, good to see you. How are things? You all right?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good, 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 good. Welcome to the podcast. It's been long overdue, actually. I've been meaning to get you on for ages. So bad me. And I'm so keen to get into your specialist topic around resilience, how we develop ourselves, how we look after ourselves, both individually and team as well. So I'm really keen to get into that, and I'm conscious that potentially we should probably start with some definitions. I'm as much inspired by the work, but also very clear that this has become quite a crowded space where everyone's barking about the same concept fundamentally, but with different meanings, different spin. So rather than go straight to the definition, could I just ask you to tell me a little bit about your background, and then maybe you could sort of help me with leading into how you got into the area to start off with. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an associate professor in sport and performance psychology at Nottingham Trent University. Do a lot of research around the psychology of performance excellence in sport, but also in other domains such as business. Um, Particular interest around resilience, as you mentioned, at both the individual level, the team level, and the organizational level, but also starting to do some work in the areas of psychological safety and mental health as well. I guess something that I'm very passionate about is not just doing research for the sake of doing research, but actually doing research that can actually have an impact in practice. So, as well as doing the research, I work with teams and organizations around developing cultures and environments to develop resilience. So, I guess that's kind of a bit of a bio around myself.
Mm.
I guess how I got into the area, probably a couple of personal stories were um, I went to a very high achieving boys' school back in North London, where I grew up. And it was a school where there was a kind of an unwritten rule and expectation to do traditional subjects such as law, business, economics, medicine, for example. And I was in a peer group who were doing those traditional subjects, aiming for things like Oxford and Cambridge, but it really wasn't for me. But I actually succumbed to that peer pressure, I would say. It wasn't actually to do with parental expectations, it was actually more peer and school expectations. And I ended up applying to law school, but didn't actually get into any law schools. The thought of even studying something sport related was completely unheard of. So I would say actually my resilience levels in that context, where I succumbed to that peer pressure, wasn't particularly brilliant. But where I kind of turned that around was I had to end up taking a gap year between um, school and university. I ended up working for PricewaterhouseCoopers as a tax consultant on their gap year scheme, and I was offered a job at the end of my time there. And that was a real kind of moment in myself around thinking, do I take a job which is earning me a very, very good salary at the age of 21, or do I pursue postgraduate study in sports psychology and actually pursue something that I'm really, really passionate about? So I think that definitely started my journey really into sports psychology. And then I guess from a sporting point of view, I was technically and tactically a very good young cricketer on the brink of kind of county standard and above. So I was a leg spin bowler, and I was able to do things in training brilliantly.
Right.
but I just wasn't able to convert that into competition. And I struggled particularly with coach feedback, particularly when the feedback became very, very technical and very, very strategical, particularly at the age of 13, 14, where you just want to be playing for fun. And when
Mm.
coaches got into some of that technical level of detail, I really, really struggled to take that feedback. From a cricketing sense, my dad's expectations, I really struggled with that because he wanted to really pursue, get me to pursue playing cricket, probably living his dream through me a little bit, but struggled with that a little bit. And then, as I mentioned, yeah, I was brilliant in training, but I just couldn't convert that into competition. I still remember a time where I think it was county trials. My first over, I think I bowled three. Beforehand, I was able to bowl it on the spot every single time, turn the ball a huge amount. But in my first over, I think in trials, I think I bowled 3 or 4 full tosses. Um, I was then taken off, and yeah, wasn't able to then kind of pursue, kind of going to the elite side of things. But it just got me really interested in terms of why is it, and I guess that's what got me into the area of resilience is why is it that some individuals are able to withstand the pressures of high level sport and achieve their peak performances, whereas others like myself succumb to those demands and underperformed.
Right.
And yeah, I guess that kind of personal journey around that really kind of instigated my, I guess, journey into sports psychology, but then obviously then studying, I guess, resilience a little bit more specifically.
So you've had quite an interesting background there, where there's potentially a sort of conformity pressure to go down a certain route, to wear the suit, to get the good salary, perhaps rather than, and this is me being disingenuous to those professions, but follow your passions, do something interesting, or do just follow your interests in that sense of, and that spark of following what you're interested in is then, I guess, fueled a little bit by this sense of difference of how am I not being able to do that? My version of that question, which I think a lot of performance science staff have got, where that started them on the path, was why am I not good? It wasn't sort of why can't I do it in performance. I was getting everything out in performance. It just wasn't very good. It was good enough at the time, but it wasn't great. So you've had a bit of a spark into and a drive to start to explore that area, and then honing in specifically about succumbing to those pressures. And does that build into the kind of resilience area in terms of what that follows on from the topics you're interested in?
Yeah, I think I guess when we're talking about resilience, or whenever I describe it, I talk about it as being able to maintain functioning when under pressure. Um, And I think from my own experiences, there have been some occasions where, yes, I've been able to, again, when we're talking about functioning, I guess in a sporting sense, we're talking, yes, about performance, but we're also talking about well-being. So the ability to maintain performance and well-being when under pressure. And I think, yeah, I could definitely think of some occasions where in some contexts, I've been able to do that really, really well. I've been able to maintain my performance and well-being under certain pressurized conditions. But certainly in my sporting experiences, doing that under high level competition, um, something that I probably, if I think back to it, maybe didn't have enough practice in training, simulating those kind of competition demands. And also, obviously, when I was competing 14, 15, so that was about 20 odd years ago, sports psychology really still was in its kind of infancy. And even coach education around sports psychology, I think, if my coaches were better placed to think about how after that particular county trial where I didn't perform particularly well, what could they do to work to help me in terms of their feedback, the environment that they were creating. I'm not necessarily suggesting that I would have gone on to then being an elite level cricketer, but I would have definitely, yeah, had probably a more enjoyable experience and maybe even tried it out and learned from some of those kind of initial more challenging experiences. Yeah.
And so, could you just clarify that definition then, and also any valid variations of that? I suppose there's the classic physics definition of resilience, which is that almost like a bouncing ball, isn't it? That it will deform and then it will have some sort of bounce back and reform. And I suppose taking that literally for us as people, that's going to translate as, well, you're going to deliver, and then we need you to bounce back and deliver again. There's a sort of a temporal, time-based phase to it, as opposed to, no, you're going to perform and perform well and going to be happy, which is what I'm getting from your definition.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the definition, or I guess where some of the debate and discussion is around, is actually the word maintenance.
Right.
So often when we're thinking about resilience, there is a debate around, is it that bounce back where you actually might succumb to those demands, your functioning might actually dip and deteriorate before then returning to, I guess, baseline levels? Or is resilience about actually maintaining that functioning where you might have small kind of um, small dips, but not kind of dramatic dips, where you have my natural dips, and that's the maintenance. The other suggestion around resilience, but for me, this is actually where it gets into thriving. There's a whole body of work around thriving, which is actually not just about maintaining functioning, but actually enhancing or having an enhanced level of functioning following some sort of pressure or adversity. But generally speaking, when we're talking about resilience, we are talking about the maintenance of, but there is some discussion about actually, sometimes we make the distinction between what we call rebound resilience,
Okay.
which is that bounce back, as you kind of suggested, or what we might call robust resilience, which is that kind of maintenance.
So if I fly with a couple of examples, it would be the long jumper having maybe two no jumps. They've hit the plasticine twice in succession, and if they don't nail the next one, then they're out. They're out of the competition. They don't go through to the next phase. And so maintenance in that situation is that actually you're under increasing or growing pressure that's starting to escalate for you. The jump's still a jump, but ultimately it's got some greater importance attached to it. But you've just got to maintain your jumping ability. There's no sense of you have to do something special, but there's the you just need to do what you need to do, despite everyone watching you, despite you having this inner monologue about worry and I'm not going to do it. That's the sort of example that I'm sort of thinking of hearing your maintenance definition.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an example of, yeah, what we would probably term that robust resilience, so that ability to maintain functioning. I think that's a good example of that.
And so that sort of toughness and impenetrable sort of, look, I'm going to be tough in this situation, that defends against that stressor. Um, that's become almost like a cliched version of resilience, as far as I can see. That we're all talking about being resilient, and there's resilience training in primary schools, and all these sorts of things that's created this multi-million pound industry as much as anything. Um, and so, what's your interpretation of where the research is at, what we know, versus where the marketing is at?
I think that's a really good question. Resilience has, you mentioned their toughness. I'm not going to get into the debate around the difference between kind of resilience and what you might call kind of mental toughness. Um, but I think resilience has become a buzzword. And as you mentioned there, in education, in business, and in sport, I guess the danger of resilience being a bit of a buzzword is that the word resilience has been lost in translation, definitely. Um, I guess if I were to identify four or five kind of what I would call myths and misconceptions. We've written a piece around a book chapter. There's a really good book out there called The Myths of. I think you had Amy and Jen on
We did.
Around
Yeah, there
the
it
myths
is.
of sports coaching, and we wrote a chapter in that particular book around some of the myths and misconceptions of resilience in high performance sports. So I guess if I would go through those, and maybe we can then start to unpick some of those. um, Firstly, resilience is not a fixed trait. Resilience is a dynamic process. Resilience is a skill or capacity that is just not automatically developed. It needs to be intentionally cultivated by design. Resilience is not about how we endure, it's about how we recharge. Resilience is not solely individual, it's relational and environmental. And resilience is not about the absence or suppression of emotion. Resilience is actually about our thought and emotional awareness. So I think certainly in terms of some of the media stuff that you might see, or some of the lay person understanding around resilience, that's probably the bits around it being a fixed trait, about it being about endurance, about showing no emotion. That's probably where some of the things have come from that we've tried to tackle and address in terms of some of our kind of our work.
Okay, so there's loads there. Maybe I just pick up on that last one, that absence of emotion. That's quite interesting in the sense that the if I fly with that cliched version, it's just put on your big boy, big girl pants and get on with it, tough it out. That sense, when actually understanding the emotion sounds like it might be part of kind of developing a resourcefulness for yourself.
Yeah, those who demonstrate resilience, we know from the research that those who demonstrate resilience actually face a lot of negative emotions. So feelings of shame, guilt, embarrassment, anger. And it's not that they don't experience those emotions, they're just better able to actually firstly accept those emotions and then take the time to process and manage those emotions. So as you said, that idea of just getting on with it, stiff upper lip, that's not what resilience is about. Resilience is actually taking the time to be self-aware of what you're thinking and you're feeling, and particularly if those thoughts and feelings are unhelpful, it's then taking the time to process and manage that.
Okay, so that hints to this idea that it's not necessarily something that you are born with, but actually you can cultivate it. That, and so what are your tips there that and maybe I need to distinguish a couple of things here about the sort of daily, I think you call them in your research daily hassles, um, and big events that can be quite disturbing, can be quite stressful, that you will need to sort of dig yourself back out from. Maybe if we can just do some clarification about that, but also then maybe if you could suggest, okay, there's a skill and an intentional approach to understanding what you've experienced that can develop future resilience.
Yeah, and I think that's really important in terms of language and terminology. I often hear people labeling individuals as either resilient athletes or
Yeah.
resilient individuals, and I often talk about resilience on a continuum where you can have higher or lower levels of resilience depending on context and depending on time. Um, and I think if we move away, if we continue using that label of resilient, it kind of implies that there's nothing you can do about your resilience levels. Um, Whereas again, we know that actually we need to think about resilience as a capacity that needs to be developed, trained, and practiced in the same way that you might think about your technical and your physical skills. Um, I guess about how you go about developing resilience. And as you mentioned, it does depend on context. So how you might develop resilience in relation to daily hassles might be very different to how you develop resilience in relation to more kind of significant life events. We've developed what we call mental fortitude training, resilience training, a bit of a framework which is very, very practical, and it focuses on three areas. It focuses on personal qualities, which are your kind of psychological skills, psychological characteristics. It focuses on what we call a challenge mindset, which is specifically around helping individuals to view pressure as an opportunity rather than viewing pressure as a threat. And then the third aspect of the framework is focusing on creating what we call a facilitative environment, um, which is a balance between social agents, or whether that's coaches, parents, people in the organization, etc., having that balance between kind of an environment where there is high challenge and high support. So in terms of the development of the resilience, we're not suggesting that this is a one size fits all, where actually, this is the only approach to developing resilience, but certainly we found it to be a useful framework, certainly in the sporting kind of context.
Could we go through a couple of those?
Yes.
And I'm almost anticipating those personal qualities, the whether that's a personality characteristic or a trait, whether that's something that kind of predisposes you to a degree of resilience. I'm also conscious that if you might not have the perfect blend, you can still develop it by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about some of those personal qualities that might support a more resilient approach?
Yeah, sure. So this is actually based on some of the research that we did looking at resilience in Olympic champions. And we identified five, again, these aren't necessarily the five, but we identified, I guess, five clusters of psychological factors that we knew, or what we found, to underpin resilience in these athletes. So these were motivation, confidence, focus, having a positive personality, and what we termed perceived social support. So yeah, those were the five, I guess, clusters of psychological factors that we identified as kind of underpinning the resilience performance relationship.
That's interesting. That you keep giving me these lists, Mus. I'm going to be diving deeper and deeper. So I've gone the first five, and then I've gone into one of those, and you've given me three, and then we're going to go even further. This is going to be an endless conversation. Okay. Let me try not to go into that too much then. But I want to come back to those fortitude comments. So personal qualities, challenge mindset, facilitative environment.
Yeah.
But picking up on those personal qualities, motivation, confidence, that sounds focus, that sounds, that I get that. Being in those sorts of environments with Olympic champions, yeah, that there is a strong sense of that immediately. The one thing that I'm going to quiz you on there is around positive personality. I was when I first started working in this world, I was actually quite surprised how it wasn't the sort of gung ho, yeah, we're going to do it, we're going to smash it every day. It was actually a lot of worry, a lot of concern. But probably what I heard differently from Olympic champions, Olympians, was okay, these are my concerns. So what am I going to do about it? There was a sense of agency that I'm going to sit with that worry and that concern and those risks, and be that person who's feeling inhibited by that, but then activating themselves to actually do something about it.
Yeah, I think actually the term positive personality has a certain connotation to that.
Okay.
It's not suggesting that these are, or these Olympic champions that we talk to, they weren't necessarily talking about being extroverted or being kind of unduly optimistic. In fact, they use
Right.
the term actually realistic optimism, which I thought was quite a nice way of kind of approaching it. Is that, yes, there is an element of looking for ways that things can be done, but with an element of realism attached to that. And also, it wasn't just about extroversion. We talked to a lot of Olympic champions where
Mm.
actually having that introversion, that ability to reflect, actually was a really important part of their kind of personality. I think one particular trait we could discuss about whether it's a trait or something that can be developed, that they talked about, was this ability to be proactive. And we kind of couch that within this idea of having a positive personality is actually seeking initiative, looking for things to change. And I would argue this is really important from a resilience point of view, that rather than thinking about resilience as just reacting when things are going wrong, putting plans and strategies in place before they actually happen. And a lot of the things that were talked about was actually being, in terms of a personality disposition, about being very, very proactive, seeking out initiative, seeking out change before change was actually required. That kind of constituted part of having a positive personality.
So I'm hearing authentic confidence
Yeah,
there. Or it's not a gung ho, if you believe it, you can achieve it type of nonsense. It's grounded. There's belief because of evidence, that realistic evidence, but it's also grounded in that you've done the work, you've prepared. At the very least, it might not be you've prepared for the incident that has kicked off or the competitor who is on fire that you're worried now about, but you can at least say, well, I've done what I can. I've applied myself and sufficiently rigorously in this arena to actually be confident.
yeah. So I think there's quite a little bit of nuance, in similar to the kind of the positive personality. There's nuance around some of the other psychological characteristics and qualities. So, for example, in relation to motivation, it's not necessarily about high levels of motivation, but actually about optimizing motivation. So a lot of the athletes that we spoke to talked about, yes, being extrinsically motivated in terms of wanting to win medals, but actually making sure that that was supported by really strong intrinsic motivations in terms of the value, the learning, the fun that kind of came on from that. Um, Similarly, with confidence, it wasn't necessarily about always maintaining high levels of confidence, but actually being able to have stable levels of confidence, particularly when athletes went through difficult or challenging situations. And then probably the last one, which I think is really interesting, is that ability to maintain focus. A lot of the athletes that we spoke to said it wasn't just about being able to switch on when required, but also being able to switch off. And for me, that goes back to the myth that we talked earlier on about resilience of being about recharging, not just about enduring. And the aspect of switching on, switching off being a really, really crucial part of that process. So I guess when you see them as labels in terms of motivation, confidence, and focus, you think, yeah, those seem quite intuitively make sense. But when you start to dig a little bit deeper, you start to see where some of the nuances kind of come in.
Okay, that's fascinating in itself, in that just the subtleties of the of interpretation there. Can I pick up on that last point about social support? And one of my favourite examples of this is when you sort of support an athlete or somebody who's going into the arena, sometimes a lead coach that I'm working with, and they go into the arena, and I think, all right, my job's done. I can watch them, and I get a text like a few minutes before they're about to perform, um, and I go, oh, that's interesting. They need a bit of extra support, or perhaps that little bit of confirmation that everything's going to be okay. Um, could you just tell a little bit about the social support and the importance of that? And if we know that we've got some parents and coaches that tune into the podcast, and if there's any top tips about how you can support people in the best way.
Yeah. So in terms of resilience and social support, I think it goes also back to one of the myths that we talked about earlier about resilience not being solely individual, but also resilience being relational. And we need to kind of, I guess, appreciate that resilience and social support are very much interlinked with one another. It's not necessarily about the support itself, but it's actually about the perception of that support that is actually more important from a resilience point of view. Because often we might think that we're giving athletes or giving individuals lots and lots of support, but if they don't think that that support is available to them, it's the perception of their support is more important than the actual support itself.
Right. Okay, so are there any specific things that you'd want to see if you were thinking about athlete, coach, environment? What are the sorts of things from a social support point of view that you'd be wanting to see or hear? Um, Appreciating your last point about the perception, but are there any key phrases, or are there any, is it the manner in which support tends to enhance how it's received?
Yeah, I think obviously support comes in. I think the one thing to appreciate is that support comes in many different forms. So I think it's worth finding out from athletes what type of support is needed from them, but also which people are best able to give them that particular type of support. So an exercise that I often do actually with working with athletes is listing what kind of support is important. So informational support could be technical support, financial support, emotional support, what types of support are important, and matching the person who they think is best able to provide that particular type of support. From a social support point of view, we talk about that as the matching hypothesis.
Okay, so it's not so much a playbook of ways in which you could develop somebody. It's actually asking them, what's best, how can I best support you, and working with that.
Yeah, and I think that would help increase the perception that support is available to them, both in terms of the types of support, but also help them to reflect on which people they should go to for that particular type of support. Because often an athlete, let's say, might go to someone for a particular type of support and then think, actually, I'm not getting support. And it's just that they've gone to the wrong person for that particular type of support.
Right.
So I think raising that awareness around which people are best placed from their perspective around giving the different types. So that could be coach, that could be parents, that could be teammates, but even for example, teammates, specifying which individuals within their team, even within parents, if they've got a mum and a dad, which types of support will the mum give? Which types of support will the dad give? That the athlete will kind of receive or kind of be most conducive to. So I think it's really being specific with that reflection around what type of support and which people are best placed to give that individual that type of support.
I'm conscious as we're talking through this and these personal qualities and the fortitude aspects, and I'm conscious that we're framing a lot of this around the athlete, which is fair because they're the ones that go out and perform. But at least they've got an outlet. You know, it's like you're going to go and play. You're going to burn some energy. As supporters, leaders, coaches, parents, the loved ones that are there to support, they're sitting down with the heart rate going, watching somebody perform. I suppose there's, my question is about just how applicable this type of research and thought process is to those who are in support of an athlete too.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I know we might get to this later on the line around where kind of, for example, resilience research might kind of go to. I think ultimately at the moment, the majority of the research has focused on athletes themselves. But I think there is a growing body of work, for example, looking at coach resilience. Jolan Kieglis, for example, from the Netherlands, has done a lot of really good work around that space. We've started a program of research looking at parental resilience, so resilience in parents. So I think you're definitely right that I think this research definitely does apply to other kind of people in the kind of the performance environment. But I think we definitely need more research in those kind of spaces to understand that resilience is just not relevant to athletes. It's relevant to a whole variety of individuals, leaders, coaches, parents, support staff as part of that process as well.
I think if I was to go back in time, I would probably spend more focus understanding who the partner is, if there is one, and what role they play. We think about parents, but I suppose the parental role starts to reduce as a partner emerges, and probably understanding how they best could be supportive of the performer in the future. All right, interesting. Right, let's go back a little step then. So, fortitude, personal qualities, we've given that one a bit of a chat. Challenge mindset, seeing pressure as an opportunity. Talk me through that.
Yeah, and I'm sure, Steve, you've heard this phrase. It is a phrase that gets bounded about a little bit, so we've got to be a little bit careful. But you often hear elite athletes, and particularly really high-level elite athletes, talking about pressure being a privilege. So it's very much that kind of mindset where you're viewing pressure as an opportunity to develop, to show your potential, to grow as an individual, rather than viewing pressure as a threat to your own performance and well-being. And part of the challenge mindset is about recognizing that although you can't control the situation, you can't control the event or the circumstance, you can control how you react and respond. And this is very much based around cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, or rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, which is about helping people to recognize that our thoughts influence how we feel and behave. It's not the event itself that influences how we feel and behave. It's our thoughts that influence how we feel and act. And helping people to, I guess, become smarter. It's not. I often make the point that it's not about positive thinking. It's not about changing negative thoughts into positive thoughts, but it's about recognizing that there is an alternative way to view a situation and reframing that situation from a slightly different angle and perspective.
That feels like a piece of knowledge that can actually be a relief for people, in understanding that I get to have control. I've got a little bit more agency as a consequence of understanding that these thoughts are going to fly in at different angles, but potentially I can change the record. I can change the narrative, and that in itself will have an effect on emotion. That will affect my behaviors.
And I think, yeah, it really helps to put the, I guess, the not accountability might not be the right word, actually, the freedom, the control back to the individual. That yes, although you can't control actually what you're going to necessarily experience, you can control your reactions and responses to that, and it helps to instill that, level of kind of responsibility, accountability. I guess one specific example of that, and it kind of links a little bit back to the motivation part, is the way that pressure is viewed, particularly at kind of high level elite sport, is interesting for me, the distinction between seeing something as a sacrifice versus seeing something as a choice. And that for me is an example of maybe what you might call a challenge mindset, where you might see something as a choice. As an elite athlete, it is your choice where you're going to be training 3-4 times a week, sometimes training during and competing during unsociable hours, seeing that as a choice rather than seeing that as a sacrifice where, for example, you don't get the same opportunities to interact with families and friends. So for me, that's where language becomes really, really important, is how do you frame these situations? Do you see something as a choice? Do you see it as a sacrifice? And how do you kind of internalize that within yourselves? It's just one specific example, really, in relation to that.
Yeah, I like that. And one of the coaching phrases I use, I can't remember where I stole it from actually, but it was when I hear people saying, oh, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, and try and reframing that to I get to. So there's a real subtlety to the perspective of the that I'm burdened with this awful stress and experience, or I get to be somebody who does sport for a living. Those sorts of gratitudinal perspectives.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think Steve, sorry to interrupt. Just to make you and the audience aware, is actually the challenge mindset, CBT, REBT. The US Army have used some of these skills. They've spent over $100 million US on building soldiers' resilience, and They've got 7, I'm always a bit hesitant to recommend books because there's a lot of resilience help books out there which aren't very scientific, but the army one is a really good balance between being evidence-based and very, very practical. And a lot of the skills that they develop or they talk about are actually based around this idea of a challenge mindset. So there are actually skills and strategies and techniques that individuals can use to reframe how pressure is viewed. And ultimately, the foundation of that is what they call learning your ABCs, which is about appreciating that we have an activating event, which is the A. We have beliefs and thoughts about that acting event, which is the B. And then we've got consequences, which are our feelings and behaviors. And we have to recognize that we go through a process of A, B, and C rather than going straight from A to C. And then on the back of that skill, there are many other skills that kind of go into that in a little bit more detail. So once you're aware, for example, that your beliefs influence how you feel and behave, you can then start to explore your beliefs a little bit more in detail. So some of the things that I do with athletes and coaches actually is exploring some of their thinking traps. So they're kind of unhelpful patterns of thinking that we're all susceptible to as individuals. So that could be mind reading, that could be jumping to conclusions, that could be magnifying the negatives and minimizing the positives. These are all kind of examples of thinking traps. So I guess the reason I highlight that is actually the challenge mindset and this idea of reframing is a skill that can be taught. There are strategies, etc., that can be learned to develop that challenge mindset.
Right. Okay. Very nice. And we'll grab the name of the book and put that link into the notes afterwards, if that's okay, because that sounds particularly useful. But also that military perspective is quite unique from the point of view that we're not talking about jumping into a sandpit or throwing a spear here. We're talking about life and death consequences of feeling a real, genuine, threatening pressure, but preparing for that beforehand and what to do in the heat of the moment.
Yeah, and I think the context definitely is different, and we might come to it at the end. But the one thing I really like about the US Army example is they had it wasn't just the fact that they put a lot of money behind the program, but there was all the way buy-in from Congress to senior management, all the way down to soldiers, and resilience development. It was integrated as part of the community with veterans and with families. So I think the reason I like using that example is that for me it's an example where resilience development, it isn't just a tick box exercise, but it's actually a sustained, genuine initiative for sustained change over a period of time. But yeah, we might come back to that.
Yeah.
Come back to that later.
Well, I don't know whether this is a dovetail from that when you're talking about all systems being educated and being thoughtful and practiced and skilled at developing certain characteristics in a certain environment. That last point that you talked about being a facilitative environment. Now, this is probably one of my favorite frameworks that I think you're going to go on to. But does this lead us into sort of the place that you operate in? What's it feel like? How's it going to encourage you? How's it going to stretch you as people? That environmental factor that can influence how you respond, but also how the team responds.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the myth that resilience is not solely individual; it is environmental, and basically the environmental conditions that are created can either actually increase or enhance someone's resilience, or can potentially undermine their resilience. And a quote that I often use, it's not resilience specific, but I think it has lots of relevance, is that when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And often when we think about resilience development, we focus on the flower, we focus on the individual, we don't focus around the plant food, the sunlight, the watering, etc. So yes, for me, most of my actual, I would say, consultancy or kind of more practical applied work is actually working with coaches, working with leaders to think about the environment that they're creating for their athletes. For me, a very, very important part of the 3-part framework for sure.
Okay, so talk me through how you foster that. What are the things that you're looking for to get to the point of facilitative environment?
Yeah, so I think probably one step back from that is when we kind of conceptualize the environment, the two kind of things that we talk about there are challenge and support. So I guess when we're talking about the facilitative environment, we're talking about an environment where there is both high challenge and high support. And then I guess we can then have a bit of a discussion and conversation about, okay, what does that actually look like then in practice? So for me, a facilitative environment is an environment where feedback, as an example, is a two-way conversation between athlete, coach, and a variety of other individuals. And actually, athletes are craving that constructive feedback. Feedback's not just a one-way process. Individuals in a facilitative environment actually have ownership around their goals. Goals is not something that is again dictated by someone, but actually it's a two-way piece. Um, Individuals are looking to develop themselves and looking to seek out challenges. So that for me is where there's a conversation there around how how does a coach and an individual come together to think about what are some of the challenges that that individual needs to then subsequently develop their performance and to develop their resilience kind of to subsequent challenges. And I think other aspects around um, certainly a facilitative environment is an environment where there is definitely aspects around psychological safety. So where people are free to share their opinion without fear of judgment, but also free to take risks, where mistakes are seen as a learning opportunity, etc. So yeah, a few kind of generic, I guess, features or qualities of what I would consider to be part of that facilitative environment.
Now, if I understand the framework correctly, you've got low challenge, low support, which is stagnant, I believe.
Yeah.
You've got low challenge, high support, which is comfortable. And then you've got high challenge, low support, which is relentless. And then
Unrelenting. Yeah.
unrelenting,
Unrelenting or
unrelenting.
relenting. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, that sounds like I was sponsored by a caffeine drink, wasn't it? There, and then facilitative environment is high challenge, high support. And so, can I just ask you then about potentially two of those quadrants, comfortable and unrelenting? If you've got a situation where people are in a comfortable environment, how are you able to move somebody up into that facilitative environment? What are the things that you would be encouraging leaders or coaches to be putting in place or saying that helps get them rising to the challenge?
Yeah, and I think probably before I answer that directly, I think the first thing to recognize is that for me, being in there's nothing wrong actually for me about being in a comfortable environment. There might be occasions or part of a season or part of the timing where actually you're periodizing it in such a way where actually being in a comfortable environment where there is high support is actually needed. I guess the only thing to be aware of is in a comfortable environment, you're unlikely to have high levels of performance if you're in a comfortable environment for a prolonged period of time. But yeah, notwithstanding that, I think ultimately in a comfortable environment, there is not enough challenge in that environment ultimately. So I guess as coaches and leaders is to think about creative ways where challenge can be incorporated. But the key bit though is that it's not just about the challenge itself, but it's how it's progressively adaptable, how it's developmentally appropriate, um, how it is, I guess, accelerated. So, for example, if a challenge is provided and athletes are actually able to manage those challenges well, how do you then take the time to increase that challenge even further? And I think one framework or one, I mentioned Yolan Keegler's work, who does a lot of stuff around coaches' resilience. He's published a really nice piece of work looking at what they've called coaches' use of planned disruptions in high performance
Oh, I
sport.
love that.
Um, and there's some really nice practical examples there around what coaches can do obviously probably most suitably in training to incorporate some of those planned disruptions. So that could be trying to simulate poor refereeing decision making, simulating competition conditions, we've done some work around training in really poor facilities that if you're we worked with a swimming club who had brilliant facilities, and then when they trained in meets where the pools weren't so great, their athletes really struggled. So we got them to train in some really poor facilities so that when they went to poorer facilities they were better able to deal with that. So yeah, they come up with different classifications around how you can incorporate planned disruptions as part of that kind of training setup. So that's for me probably what needs to be, if you're in that comfortable environment, how can you notch up that challenge? I guess that the key bit is you don't move from that comfortable environment to that unrelenting environment.
So,
And
but
that's
and so that direction is quite interesting because I'm going to assume that if an environment is comfortable, like I take your point about seasonal and periodized approach, but if it is comfortable, that people might be used to that and they might be happy with that, and they might have actually been people who have fostered that and created that environment. And so, how do you? What is? I guess there's a million ways in which you could do this, but what are the sort of surefire ways of being able to up the challenge for people so that they feel supported, but I'm also stretched in the right way?
yeah, and I think for me that's where challenge doesn't automatically come from coaches, leaders. I think that's where it's a two-way conversation with an athlete around, from their point of view, what challenges do they think that they need to push them outside of their comfort zone or help them develop as an individual and help them develop as an athlete. So I actually see challenge as a co-construction between athlete and coach. Um, and also thinking about creative ways that can be done. I think there are things that can be done kind of quite creatively in quite fun ways where it might not necessarily see that actually that challenge is being done, but actually subtly that challenge is being created in that kind of environment. So I think for me that the buy-in, I think you're kind of alluding to this a little bit, there needs to be buy-in from athletes that ultimately um, challenge is going to be created. There's a reason why we're doing this, to ultimately to help with your performance. Probably the one thing I would say is to make athletes aware that maybe in the short term there might be a little bit of discomfort. There might be actually their performances might dip in the short term, but the idea of providing challenge is actually more for the medium to long term, in terms of that journey and that development. So I think it's for me the rationale and justification as to why that challenge is being provided, but then also a little bit of a debrief that once that challenge is provided, as a coach, as a leader, do you need to increase that challenge even further, or do you need to increase and provide a little bit more support?
Okay, and I suppose this is growing as an area of I suppose the hierarchical approach of I'm the coach, I'm going to set the tone, I'm going to talk to you as I want, or I'm going to talk to you as my coach talked to me. Um, that monodirectional approach of command and control type thing. I suppose this is actually unveiling a way in which we can develop people, but it is ultimately agreed. You know, if we're going to aspire for this, we've got to work out a way. We've got to come up with something between us, probably at the right age of agreement. You know, that there's a sense of maturity to that. But that feels like it's a useful framework by which you can set the right tone to be able to push people and to feel as though they've got their back.
Yeah, and I think what interesting discussion that I have is whenever I speak to coaches about this framework, there's an interesting discussion about, well, if I'm being challenging, I can't be supportive.
Yeah.
And if I'm being supportive, I can't be challenging. And I guess what hopefully this framework kind of illustrates is that you can be challenging and supportive at the same time. And that can have a positive impact on both performance and well-being. There doesn't need to be a kind of a sacrifice of one or the other. Um, if we go back to the definition of resilience, the ability to maintain functioning being both performance and well-being, the ability to maintain performance and well-being when under pressure, in my view, that facilitative environment, challenge and support to support both performance and well-being, to support both the athlete and the person. ultimately at the end of the day.
And so, did we cover going from unrelenting to facilitative in that? I don't know whether we've
I
actually
don't think we
covered it.
have.
No,
No.
okay, but no, but I suppose the same sort of concepts apply, don't they? How do you want to be supported? Would be one way in which you'd take someone forward. But how would you up support from an unrelenting place? My my question here is driven by probably environments where I'm pretty sure it was unrelenting. And then suddenly you've got this sort of, oh, we back you, we believe in you sort of sense of, like, where's all this coming from? I don't believe you, because it's now feeling completely sort of polar opposite to being driven, being pushed, and perhaps being flogged a little bit.
Yeah, and I think I've had a lot of conversation about this unrelenting environment. I think for me, I do this as a bit of an audit exercise that I kind of list some of the characteristics in terms of what we found to be characteristic of an unrelenting environment. So those could be, for example, a bit of a blame culture. You know, people looking to blame other people when high standards are not met, isolation, people dropping out, burning out, etc. And when we have that discussion of that characteristics, I then kind of ask, do you notice any of these characteristics in your environments? Because even if you don't notice all of them, if you're starting to recognize one or two of these characteristics, that's for me what I would call kind of red flags. You know, if you're starting to recognize one of the two of these characteristics, those are probably red flags which suggest that you're moving in that unrelenting direction, and probably suggest that you need to move in that kind of facilitative direction. And I have lots of conversations with coaches to say, well, you know, if I use the football kind of context as an example, you know, we need to provide academy context to be unrelenting because we're preparing them for the first team. I just don't buy it. I don't think there is any need at all whatsoever for individuals to be in an unrelenting environment. You can be in that high challenge, high support environment, and still, if the issue is, well, performance is going to be affected. Actually, in high challenge and high support, your performance is still going to be heart and center of everything. Um, so I think the negative consequences of being in an unrelenting environment, I guess that's where you've got a lot of the things that have come through around, you know, the winning at all costs cultures that have been talked about a little bit. Um, in my view, I don't think there is any need at all to be in an unrelenting environment, regardless of level or context.
And in some of our pre-discussion and conversations, you flagged actually an important aspect of the consequences of defining resilience inaccurately. Could you just unlock that there? Because that to me feels like you've set if the academy example, you've set a goal. We want to prepare people for the top league, and it is unrelenting there. So therefore, we have to bring it back. That's where the goal has sort of informed practice as opposed to thinking about optimizing conditions. So, yeah, let me go back to the question about what are the consequences of defining resilience inaccurately?
Yeah, the example, and it links back to the unrelenting environment a little bit. Is this was the example of British gymnastics in relation to the White Review? Obviously, allegations of mistreatment and abuse in the sport. The White Review covered many different areas, a 300-page report. But what was really interesting was that the culture to develop resilience. What Anne White concluded was the culture to develop resilience, and I'm putting resilience in inverted commas for a reason. The culture to develop resilience contributed to maltreatment and abuse in the sport. And when you dug into the report in a little bit more detail, as recent as 2020, there were coach curriculum materials that was defining resilience as the ability to suffer. And Anne White goes on to say that this use of language does little to move the culture on. For me, that's not strong enough. I think defining resilience as the ability to suffer. If you're defining resilience in that way, if coaches are defining resilience in that way, it's not surprising to me that you're going to be in a situation where there's going to be really bad practices in relation to that. So hopefully that for me illustrates an example. If you're defining resilience inaccurately, you're not describing in an evidence-based fashion. Yes, practically, but the implications of defining resilience incorrectly has massive kind of consequences in terms of coach practice, athlete expectations, etc. around that.
Okay. And can we widen this conversation a bit further in terms of the sense of individual resilience versus team resilience? And I'm conscious that we've framed a lot of this about what you personally experience, your personal qualities, whether you are up for taking on that opportunity that might come with pressure. Um, that feels like it's on you. But what about the bonds between people, the dynamics that sit within a team that are perhaps a little bit harder to measure or capture? Perhaps when you go into an environment, it might be more about feel. Could you just open up this idea about team resilience for me?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, team resilience, I guess the slight difference between team resilience and individual resilience is that team resilience, again, through some of our research, rests fundamentally on cultivating high quality relationships. That's not to suggest that those relationships are not important for individual resilience, but certainly for team resilience, that cultivation of high quality relationships becomes really, really important. We did a piece of research, my colleague Paul Morgan, where we did a case study of the 2003 England Rugby Union World Cup winning team. And through that research, we identified, sorry, this is going to be another bit of a
Got another
list,
bullet
but
list. Just spoiling me with your
another
bullet
list.
lists.
Um, 5 kind of processes that underpin team resilience. So that was transformational leadership, shared leadership, team learning, social identity, and positive emotions. But actually, majority of those you can kind of see, aspects of leadership. So transformational leadership is obviously about that one kind of charismatic, inspirational, motivational leader who gives that sense of direction. In this particular case, this was Clive Woodward. And often it's the coach, captain, etc. But from a team resilience point of view, what we also found is that it's not just about having that one individual who provides that leadership, but that ability to share that leadership throughout the team. And the reason why that's important from a resilience point of view is that helps to spread ownership and accountability. I think Clive Woodward talked about having an excellent leader in a group of great leaders. So that's just one example. And then obviously things like identity, having a really, really distinctive social identity. Owen Eastwood's done some great work around kind of sense of belonging, sense of identity. And again, that is very much built on developing those high quality relationships. So yeah, hopefully a starting point there around where team resilience might be slightly different to the idea of individual resilience.
Okay, so these are things that you could almost break down into some of their component parts and work on them separately,
Yeah.
that can be additive or cumulative for that ability for the team to be resilient. I'm just going to check there that the definition of resilience is the same in terms of maintaining performance. So is that would that be correct?
Yeah, I guess the way that it might be kind of slightly different is maybe how you would define maintaining functioning. Performance might not just be individual performance, but it might be that kind of collective performance. Similarly, with well-being, it might not just be individual well-being, but it might be collective well-being. And when we're talking about maintaining functioning under pressure, we're not just talking about individual stresses, but we're also talking about collective stresses that the team might face as well. But yeah, ultimately the essence of the definition is similar.
Okay, so I'm interpreting some of these as, like for example, team learning, the ability to be able to reflect together, debrief together, take a stressful event that perhaps didn't go well, or it was, or they've got the outcome that they wanted, and then take learning out of that, irrespective, and that type of practice that can foster a safer environment, but also a progressive environment.
Yeah, and in terms of the team learning part of it, is the technical academic term there is around kind of developing a shared mental model. So ultimately, everyone is on the same wavelength there in terms of, I think a lot of the time there's a lot of individual learning that might happen, but actually what is that learning at that kind of collective group level? the other thing around learning, which I think is really important, is that, and it also relates to individual resilience a little bit, is it's not just about the experience itself. A quote that I often use, that you don't learn from experience, you learn from reflecting on experience. So I think, yeah, it's the reflection part that's probably, and how you do that collectively, and then how do you ensure then that that reflection is translated into learning, that everyone on the team is on the same wavelength in terms of the next action points, the next training, the next competition. So it's building up that bank of knowledge collectively, I think, as part of that technical term there. Yeah, the shared mental model.
And just if I zoom out a little bit here, and if you're working with different companies or teams and you're developing these aspects, I'm going to assume to a certain extent it's needed, as opposed to we're just going to work on stuff for the sake of it. Either a gap or that there's improvements to be made. Have you got a sense of when you're working with teams how much they should be focusing on this type of topic? There are so many different areas that you could invest in terms of personal development, team development. Have you got a sense of just how much modern companies are needing to work on this?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies, both sport organizations, business organizations, I think are having resilience at their kind of forefront in terms of development, CPD staff. I guess for me, it also depends on where they're coming from in terms of resilience. If resilience development ends up just being about developing individual personal qualities, then um, I don't think that's the complete picture. I think resilience development in its more comprehensive sense is around thinking collectively around environment, thinking about bringing managers and coaches in. I talk about resilience development about being everyone's business. So I think the danger of aiming resilience development as, let's say, as just as athletes or just as employees in the context of business. There's a really nice quote that David Oliver from the NHS uses, that he talks about resilience starting to become a bit of a dirty word, because resilient, resilient, or the lack of resilience, or you're not resilient enough, the responsibility is aimed at the individual, that you're not doing something right, so you need to develop your resilience. I think we need to move away from that idea that resilience development is the sole responsibility of an individual, to think about resilience development being actually the responsibility of the collective. And that's where the environment comes in, the teams aspects of it comes in. And that's where I'm a big believer. I think senior leadership need to think about some of this stuff. So I think organizations are thinking about it, and but the danger for me, and I'm very vocal about this, is that it shouldn't just be a tick box exercise. It's not just about, Mustafa, can you come in and do a resilience webinar for me or a resilience workshop for me? Tick the box. We've now done resilience development for all of our employees or all of our athletes. That is not going to develop resilience in a sustainable fashion. So I think, yeah, I think organizations are thinking about it, whether or not they're thinking about it in that kind of sustained fashion, in that way, which is about kind of long-term change rather than just short-term. I'm still to see many organizations doing it in that way.
Well, with your frameworks here, there's a sense that there's a continued um, lasting learning aspect to that. Um, you've hinted to a couple of areas. I mean, just finally, you've hinted a couple of areas that you think actually the resilience research and support is going. You've just mentioned around that collective responsibility. We've mentioned parental and support people. Any other areas that you think that there's a frontier to still be broached?
I think for me, a big one actually, Steve, is youth sport. A lot of the findings that we're drawing upon currently are actually predominantly from adults. So a lot of the questions that I get, and I hold up my hand and say, look, we are extrapolating backwards, but that's not the right thing to do. Is, how does resilience development work from, let's say, 8, 10, and how can you periodize that from 10 to 18? So we just don't know enough about resilience in that youth development stage. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in that space. This is a methodological issue, but I think it has also practical relevance. I think we've got to become better at exploring resilience over time. Ultimately, a lot of the research at the moment is that, let's say you do a one-off interview or one-off survey-based data, and you're measuring it or you're assessing or exploring it at one time point. But if we're talking about resilience as a dynamic process, we need to understand that resilience is context specific and time dependent. So we need to do a lot more longitudinal work, I would say, around resilience. And then probably lastly, which I'm really keen to see if we can do a lot more work in this area, is actually resilience across cultures. This is the case predominantly around sports psychology, so I don't think this is resilience specific, but I think the way that resilience is conceptualized, the way that it's developed between different cultures, countries, race, ethnicities, for example, that is definitely an area where there needs to be a lot more work in that space as well. So yeah, probably those are the three in terms of the youth space, more kind of longitudinal work, and then also looking at it across and between different cultures.
Interesting. Oh, well, I can't wait to see how that evolves over time. Certainly, the one that I think is classic, that seems to be imprinting there on kids, is this fixed mindset, growth mindset, etc., etc. And which might have some hearty substance to it. The one I get asked a lot about is performance in cross-cultural teams. So it's not a case of here's how we did it in the UK, so therefore you should do it over here. Actually, now we're hearing and seeing teams assemble from around the world because of virtual working environments. But it's now a case of we're going to have to sort of undo some of the assumed ways of working, and we're going to have to check in a little bit as to how do we want to work and challenge and support each other over time. So that's a fascinating one that you flagged there. Hey, look, this has been great. Thank you so much. Such an important area, so useful. You have thoroughly treated me to a bullet point list or two, and I'm sure people are going to be making loads of notes as they listen to this once or twice, and massively topical about us trying to find ways in which we could improve the way that we're developing youngsters through sport, people through sport, and the next generation. So, thank you so much for your time.
No worries at all. I hope people found it useful.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I really hope you enjoyed this week's conversation. Now, we've got plenty more to come, so if you'd like to support and champion us, then take the time to subscribe and leave a review on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or wherever you tune in. You can also give us a follow on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All the links are in the show notes. So in the meantime, have a great week.